I guess wherever it goes, we're going to find it. Let me just say here.
Okay, I think it is.
Recording.
It is. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our 8th annual Gun Prevention Violence Sabbath that we've been observing at Temple Israel Jewish Community Center. And I want to thank our Tikkun Olam chairs, Bob Roberger and Elaine Silverstein, for organizing this event. And I am very honored to introduce Gubir Grewal, the Attorney General of New Jersey. I looked up the Attorney General's bio and I found that we were born within 3 months of each other. I'm older, and we both live in New Jersey, but that's the similarities there. I do, after having been born in Jersey City, Gubir Grewal attended Georgetown University, where he graduated cum laude and earned his law degree at the College of William and Mary. He served as Bergen County prosecutor, and since 2018, he has served as the 61st Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. Mr. Attorney General, we're grateful for you giving us the time to speak. We look forward to hearing from you about what can be done, what we're doing, what our aspirations are on the, specifically on the issue of gun control, and whatever else that you'd like to share with us.
Terrific. Thank you, Rabbi Fine, for that introduction. Thank you to Temple Israel and the JCC for inviting me to join this important annual event and to discuss some of the gun violence prevention efforts that are underway here in New Jersey. I also want to just briefly acknowledge, because I saw him sign in, Paul Aronson, not just for facilitating this invitation for me this evening, but also for his incredible work as the state's ombudsperson for individuals with disabilities. And so while we can't meet in person for this conversation, I am glad that we are having it virtually because it's an important and timely one for us to have right now. It's a timely one because shootings, unfortunately, are on the rise in our cities this year. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were seeing year-over-year decreases in violent crime in our cities, including year-over-year decreases when it came to gun violence. But now in some parts of our state, we're seeing those trends tend to reverse. And there are many reasons for this rise, and we can discuss them if time permits after our conversation. But this discussion is also timely for another reason. And that's because we're in the midst of observing, I think, two very painful and tragic days of remembrance. One has just passed. As you all know, on October 27th, we marked the 2-year anniversary of one of the deadliest anti-Semitic attacks in American history, when 11 worshipers were killed at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And less than 2 weeks from now, or actually less than 2 weeks from now, on December 10th, we'll mark the 1-year anniversary of the terrorist attacks in Jersey City, when 2 gunmen fueled by a twin hatred of the Jewish people and of law enforcement murdered Jersey City Police Detective Joseph Seals, and then laid siege at the Jersey City Kosher Supermarket, where they not only engaged in a firefight with law enforcement officers, but also took the life of Moshe Deutsch, Mindy Ferenz, Douglas Miguel Rodriguez. That was the deadliest domestic terror incident in our state's history. So these tragedies, the shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the Jersey City attacks, as well as countless others from Poway to El Paso to Charlottesville, so many others, I think all highlight not just the fact that we have a gun violence problem in this country, but that we also have a hate problem. And New Jersey is not immune to either of these problems. And so before I speak specifically to our efforts to combat gun violence, I do want to talk briefly about this rising tide of hate and intolerance that we're seeing in our state and this country, and what we're doing to deter that. Because I think over the last 4 years, like other parts of the country, we've seen the number of bias incidents in our state increase dramatically. If I look at the numbers in 2019, there were about 1,000 reported incidents of bias in New Jersey. That's a 75% increase from the nearly 570 reported in 2018. And these incidents run the gamut, from anti-Semitic graffiti to verbal attacks to physical violence to what they culminated in at the end of last year in the attacks in Jersey City. All of this is alarming, but I think what's particularly alarming in all of these numbers and all of these statistics that we look at is that we are seeing the number of youth bias incidents increase. Last year, 46% of those of the known offenders in our state were young people. They were minors. So I think regardless of whether the perpetrators are minors or adults, it's particularly pernicious when it's young people. But I think the overall effect of all these incidents is that so many individuals in many different communities in our state are afraid to go to work. They're afraid when they go to worship. They're afraid when they go to school. They're afraid when they live their daily lives. And to me, as the state's chief law enforcement officer, that's unacceptable. And I know it's unacceptable to our governor. And so here in New Jersey, we've taken meaningful steps to address the issue of bias and hate overall, but in particular, when it comes to our young people. And last year, Governor Murphy, to this end, created New Jersey's Youth Bias Task Force. And he tasked it with coming up with real solutions to this growing problem. And I'm proud to share with all of you that that task force recently issued its report. And that report not only contains a full accounting of the scope of this problem in our state, including root causes, but also offers over 25 concrete recommendations to address this problem, including significant changes to school curricula to incorporate anti-racism coursework, and reforms to make New Jersey's criminal hate crime laws among the toughest in our country. And in addition to all of that, the task force also recommended that our Division on Civil Rights, which is part of the Attorney General's office, create an online portal that makes it easier for residents to report such incidents. And we've done that. That report just came out, but we've already launched this online portal, and we call it NJ Bias. It's live right now. And I encourage you after our session to go visit it and to get more information about what we're doing here. And that can be found at bias.njcivilrights.gov. So bias.njcivilrights.gov. But even more than that, the governor also issued an executive order that directed all of our state agencies that touch on the recommendations of the Youth Bias Task Force to work to implement those recommendations, to make them a reality. So these are just some of the many, many steps we've taken to address this issue of hate that we're contending with as a country and as a state. And I'm proud and happy to discuss these efforts and others, including our work to hold social media companies accountable for their role in propagating hate and allowing bigots to find community in the anonymity of the internet. And we've done a lot there as well in taking Facebook and others to task. But I do want to return in the time that I have to share remarks to talk about gun violence, which has been one of the top priorities for me in my 3 years as Attorney General so far. From day one, what we've decided to do in New Jersey is to treat gun violence for what I believe it is, a full-blown public health crisis. And to me, it's common sense. If we as public officials can react so swiftly and so collaboratively when it comes to deaths caused by dangerous drugs, I think then we should be doing the same thing when we're seeing a public health crisis that involves guns, that is taking lives as we speak in so many of our cities and so many of our neighborhoods in this state. And so in New Jersey, we're using that same playbook that we deployed for the opioid epidemic to combat gun violence. And it's really a three-pronged approach. We're focusing on enforcement efforts, we're focusing on prevention efforts, and we're focusing on treatment efforts. And I'll give you a couple of examples of each. So for me as a career prosecutor, as Rabbi Fine shared with you, the enforcement prong comes most naturally. So we're aggressively prosecuting violent criminals who engage in gun violence or drug trafficking or other crimes that give rise to gun violence. For example, for several summers in a row, we've worked with local, state, and federal partners to arrest over 100 fugitives, including gang members in Newark, Trenton, Camden, Jersey City, Atlantic City. And among those who were arrested were fugitives who were wanted for murders. And this sends a strong message that we will be out there and we will be tireless in our efforts to hold people accountable, especially when they're fugitives from justice. But more than that, just today, we announced the arrest of 24 gang members in Trenton and the recovery of a number of weapons. What's significant about that is that those 24 gang members that we arrested, they were in the midst of planning retaliatory shootings that were going to happen in Trenton. So we intercepted those gang members and we stopped that from happening. And you might think that these are organized gangs like we see in movies and on television. We don't have that problem in New Jersey. And frankly, that problem is really something for the movies of Bloods and Crips and Latin Kings. What we see mostly in our major cities are neighborhood gangs that use violence to hold on to drug territories. And it's loosely affiliated neighborhood gangs, and they're becoming younger and younger. So, certainly part of these enforcement efforts, these sweeps are critical in making sure that the most violent, organized criminals are removed from our streets. But I think we also should take notice of another fact, that here in Bergen County, we're not immune from this activity, because just before Thanksgiving, my office arrested a man in Hasbrook Heights, right here in Bergen County, who was illegally trafficking untraceable firearms known as ghost guns. And he was selling those ghost guns into Patterson. And so he was making money off the violence associated with the drug activity there. And here's the thing, and we could talk about it more during our Q&A about ghost guns. They're illegal here in New Jersey. And these are guns that are typically assembled from kits that can be legally sold into some states, but can also be bought online by people who want to get these types of firearms and assemble them at home. But we've made it unlawful, but people still find ways to bring them into our state. They're assembled by people who have some expertise in doing this work. They aren't registered. They don't have serial numbers, and that makes them difficult to trace, and it makes it harder for law enforcement officers to solve gun crimes. So, they're particularly dangerous, and we've taken a strong, hard line against them, and our enforcement efforts have not just been limited to individuals who might use these types of weapons or sell them. We're also going after those companies, including those out-of-state companies who are selling these weapons into our state, or large capacity magazines or other unlawful items into New Jersey. So, those are some of our enforcement efforts. In addition to who we're going after, I think it's important for you to know how we're doing this, because that is also different. We are using cutting edge forensic technology to link shell casings and guns we recover at different crime scenes back to the criminals that use them. We literally treat every gun that we recover as a suspect. So if we just find a gun, we do a workup on that gun and the forensics of that gun. And sometimes we're able to link a gun recovered in Trenton to a shooting in Newark to a shooting in a different part of our state, because these are sometimes community guns that are used to fuel, that are used in support of the drug trade that might be going on between those cities. And so this is something different that we're particularly proud of, on how we're using this forensic technology to do these types of analyses that are enabling us to take dangerous individuals off our streets. And we're doing that work in partnership with some of our federal partners. When I talk about prevention, what I really mean is the strong gun laws that we have. New Jersey has some of the strongest firearm safety laws in the nation. We had strong laws before Governor Murphy came in, but Governor Murphy and this legislature have made them stronger. We have universal background checks. We have laws that limit the limits on assault rifles, on large capacity magazines, laws that keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of criminals and extremists. And Governor Murphy enacted an extreme risk protective order law, which is something that we never had before. Now law enforcement, family members, or a household member can apply for a court order, an order that prohibits an individual from possessing or purchasing a firearm or ammunition if that individual presents a danger of bodily injury to themselves or others. And that order remains in effect until that person no longer poses a threat. Previously, we only had that ability in domestic violence situations. So these are great tools that we now have to get involved on the prevention side, to prevent acts of violence from taking place. But what I want to finish on is treatment, because I think here too, New Jersey is an innovator. And I think we all have something to be proud of here, because we've been focusing on over the last year. And what was really special is that Gabby Giffords joined us for this announcement back in January. But we are focusing on those most affected by gun violence, gunshot victims. We're focusing on them to interrupt cycles of violence. With Gabby Giffords here in Jersey City this past January, we invested $20 million in federal funds into 9 hospital-based violence intervention programs, or HVIPs, across our state. 4 of them are in northern New Jersey. 1 is in Patterson at St. Joe's. Another's at University Hospital in Newark. We're at Jersey City Medical Center, and we're in Elizabeth at Trinitas Hospital down there. And so what these programs do is they reach gun violence victims in the hospital setting, and they reach them by linking medical treatment and recovery services with education, counseling, social services, case management, to cut off retaliatory violence at that time of crisis. They really change what had been a treat and release model. Treat and release policies forced hospitals to essentially just discharge vulnerable patients into the same environment where they were injured. And these policies just resulted in further victimization. So our 9 sites now have resources to ensure that the very first time a victim of violence enters a hospital, that the violence ends there. And the evidence backs us up on this. And we'll have more data after we have more time behind our program here, but looking at other parts of the country, on average, the recidivism rate for victims of gun violence who encounter hospital-based violence intervention programs is around 5%. So 5% of people who go through an HVIP are re-victimized. For those who do not interact with these programs, the recidivism rate can be as high as 25 to 35%. That's what it was at University Hospital in Newark before this program came into place. At 25%, or a quarter of the gunshot victims who left after being treated from that hospital were shot again. And if they were lucky, they were still alive and they didn't lose their lives. But that's what I mean about the recidivism rate for gunshot victims. So if we intervene at that critical moment, particularly for those who are the victims of street violence or gun violence, then we can prevent that repeat victimization, and we can help our most vulnerable residents move on to brighter paths, I think. So again, there's a lot more that we're doing to disrupt violence, to get young people onto paths to more productive lives, to reform our criminal justice system, to address larger issues of racial justice that we're all contending with. But I wanted to focus my remarks on the twin pandemics, really, of hate and gun violence that go hand in hand, and particularly as we're coming on the 1-year anniversary of the Jersey City shootings, which is a day that I vividly remember everything that happened that day and the weeks after, from responding to the scene, seeing the officers, visiting the yeshiva that was just above the kosher supermarket, and seeing 20 young boys in that classroom who, but for the grace of God, could have found, a different outcome if it weren't for the heroism and just the brave actions of law enforcement officers and others that day. And so, that is top of mind for me right now. And that's why I wanted to start by talking about the issues of hate and bias, because they just go hand in hand with some of the issues that we're dealing with. So I want to thank all of you for bringing this conversation together, because each of you, as community members, as residents of this state, play a critically important part in this conversation, that you need to challenge your lawmakers, your law enforcement officials to do more. And I think by working together on this issue, we're going to make a difference and make our state even safer and even better for all of our residents. And I think, we are at the top of the pack when it comes to these issues, but we could always do more. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Attorney General. I just two things for mechanics. There's a Q&A button at the bottom, and there's a chat button. If you can put the question in the Q&A, I think that'll be easier for all of us to see it there. And then Bob Roberger is going to sift through those and read those out loud. I also want to point out we have 59 people that are watching, 59 computers. So this is a wonderful crowd, and we would have had more, would have been to meet you in person, the same number. But I'm grateful for the technology that allows us to gather, and again, for making the time for our congregation. Bob Roberger.
Okay, so we already have a few questions. One question is, given the rise of anti-Semitism, hate groups, and gun violence, what are your thoughts on religious organizations like Temple Israel hiring armed security agents? Do you feel this increases security and safety and reduces the risk of gun violence targeting the building community, or do you feel that it increases risk?
You know, that is that's a difficult question. I think what the danger of all of these incidents that we talk about is you never know where the threat is going to come from. You did not, you know, you don't know who the next shooter is going to be or who's going to walk in with a gun. You know, so I certainly do support, and we do support grants to harden our houses of worship. And that's an unfortunate reality of the time we live in, where through our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, we do support those efforts because we do think, you know, whether it's putting anti-blast film or whether it's cameras, whether it's, you know, the visible deterrence on the outside, that could prevent something, you know, an unfortunate incident from becoming even far more unfortunate. The same way we do support the hiring of private professional security guards through grant funding for houses of worship, because the outside presence can act as a deterrence. And so I do think that there is value to that. And I do think, you know, having conversations with local law enforcement about increased patrols, obviously that visible presence has a deterrent effect. So I do think they help contribute to safety, and, you know, whether they're, you know, a cure-all and will prevent the next incident. I mean, that's, you know, that's what keeps me up at night. You just don't know sometimes where that threat is going to come from, but I think it's wise to take all those precautionary steps. And if your house of worship wants a security assessment, we offer that. I'm sure it's, you know, you've already had one done probably by your county prosecutor's office. It's certainly something we focused on when I was the county prosecutor. But those are all steps we have to take and do have a deterrent effect.
If you don't mind my pressing a little bit on the specifics, does the state have a view regarding whether security personnel should have arms themselves, one way or another?
You know, I don't know if the governor's taken an official position on that. That's where the official position of the state would come from, but we certainly do offer grant money for houses of worship to hire off-duty law enforcement professionals, other professionals to support their security efforts. So we do support it through grant funding. So, you know, if we didn't think it was a wise investment, I don't think we would be putting out that type of money. It's not a lot. It's I think it subsidizes right now. It's probably $10,000 per, you know, house of worship to hire somebody to supplement their security efforts. So, you know, those initiatives are out there.
Thank you. Next question, where does New Jersey stand on smart gun legislation?
Yeah, so we do have, and this is thanks to Senator Weinberg, who's been a champion of a lot of our gun safety laws. There is a smart gun legislation out there where, you know, once that technology is considered viable, then other measures of that legislation kick in, and we have to start moving towards the sale of smart guns only. But we have not gotten past that first hurdle of a viable smart gun technology, and that's where, you know, that triggering event has not happened. And so we do have those laws on the books, but they haven't been triggered yet.
And another congregant is asking if you would discuss some of the findings of the Youth Bias Task Force regarding why the rise of youth bias incidents is occurring.
Yeah, sure. And so this is a 100 and something page report, which I would commend you all to look at. There's executive summaries available. But I think, you know, when you look at hate, you know, hate's a learned behavior. And the Youth Bias Task Force report talks about this. And, you know, they actually quote Nelson Mandela. And it's a quote that I often lean on when I'm talking about this issue, where he says, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin, their religion, their background. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. And that's sort of like the premise of the whole report. And so they talk about contributing factors being social media, certainly is one. that has contributed to the rise and normalization of hate speech and this type of conduct. They also point to the general political climate in which we find ourselves, where there's been a normalization of hate, and it all trickles down. And I think it's, it's the issue of young people modeling their behavior based on what they see sort of normalized around them. And they speak about, there's an example in the Youth Bias Task Force report. It might be in that report or another report that our Division on Civil Rights put out. When you talk about the effect of rhetoric, a really salient example of this is President Bush after September 11th. After September 11th, we saw incidents of bias against people who may have been Muslim, or people who were perceived to be Muslim, or somehow associated, people like me who were targeted because of the way we look. You saw those types of bias incidents increase. You saw the murder of a Sikh American in Mesa, Arizona, because somebody perceived him to be part of the people responsible for the incidents of 9/11. President Bush went to a mosque in Washington, D.C., and he talked about the need for acceptance and about, calming the rhetoric and bringing down the temperature. And you saw immediately after those comments that bias offenses began to decline. It had a real effect. You go back to San Bernardino after those attacks happened in California, and you had then candidate Trump talk about a Muslim ban. And you saw immediately after that, incidents of bias and hate begin to increase. And so this is what I mean when rhetoric has real effects, and we just don't know who is that individual who just needs that gentle nudge to engage in some type of act of violence. And then you see social media, and the report talks about this too, that the algorithms, what you don't see in the real world. If somebody went to a street corner and started talking in terms of, anti-Semitic ideology or white supremacist ideology, people would not generally congregate around that person, because you have that village square that's going to be watching, and there's a degree of, norms and inhibitions, but they don't exist online. These algorithms, when you're searching for something, they drive you to somebody else who's looking for the same thing, and that's how these social media companies monetize their platforms, is by driving people together. That's where folks can find community. And so if someone has something, belief, or is looking at something, or might have other, have no other checks on their behavior, then they find community. And we've seen that a lot, where lone wolf type individuals have found community, and that behavior gets normalized. So these are some of the things that the report talks about. And they also talk about having an anti-bias curriculum, about different ways to address this in the classroom. And so I think it's a pretty remarkable piece of work. And I don't know if folks from our team are here, but they could put the link up maybe in the chat where you could find it.
What about the hospital-based program? Someone is asking about that and how we can help or get involved and support those programs.
Yeah, so we, the hospital-based programs, we launched them in hospital-based violence intervention programs. We launched them in January. So they're 9 sites. And the great thing about those is that it was a competitive grant, and the hospitals had to submit proposals. So what they had to do is find community partners. We wanted it to be community-based, because it's going to be a community-based solution that's going to address this. It's not going to be clinicians and social workers, but it's going to be people from the community who work on these street violence issues. So what we can do is tell you who the different organizations, the different hospitals work with. And I know, for example, in Newark, University Hospital is working with the Newark Community Street Team, and they, have volunteer opportunities. And other, partner organizations. I think St. Joe's might be Eva's Village, but we can get you that information about those opportunities to perhaps work with some of these groups and volunteer time there.
There are a couple of questions about New Jersey law versus the law of other neighboring states where guns might be coming in from. So one question is whether other states have similar laws to ours, and another question is whether the other states cooperate with us in enforcement of our laws.
Yeah, so that, therein lies part of the issue. We have very strong gun laws in this state. And so when we look at recovered crime guns around our state, and whether it's the case we took down that I talked about that we announced today, if we do the analysis, at the end of the day, about 80+% of our crime guns originate in other states where they don't have similarly lax or similarly strong gun laws. And so that's when you talk about this iron pipeline from southern states up I-95 where guns are being brought in. We have been historically up on plenty of wires and plenty of cases over the years where you hear about guns being sent from Georgia in the South and brought up here. And then Pennsylvania is a big source state for us too. And so that's part of the challenge, in addition to, when we talk about ghost guns or, partially completed guns. Those websites that offer these, this is not even the dark web, it's legal to sell into some states. And until we started our enforcement efforts, until we had these laws, you could actually get those guns delivered into our state. And so even after the laws came into effect, our Division of Consumer Affairs, our civil investigators did a lot of online work to try to order these to see if manufacturers were abiding by our laws. Some weren't. And when we informed them, they started abiding by our laws. When they continued to ignore our laws, we took them to court and we held them accountable. And we've reached resolution with a number of those companies. What's interesting is we had a case, I think we announced it last year, where we had information that these individuals were ordering ghost gun parts, machining them together in New Jersey. And when I say ghost guns, these are like just about the same gun you could buy from the gun shop, but it's sold in parts, no serial numbers, no way to readily trace them. So they were ordering them into New Jersey. And then when our law came into effect, we heard the chatter in our investigation that they were now getting them delivered across the river into Pennsylvania, assembling them there and then bringing them here. So, it's relentless, but other states, unfortunately, don't have similarly strong gun laws. The Attorney General in Pennsylvania and I did a joint press conference in that case where he called on his legislature to do the same thing we've done here and outlaw these weapons, because you have a right to buy a firearm if you qualify, but who needs an untraceable firearm? And in my mind, it's somebody who wants to do something illegal. And so, and if you're an enthusiast and you want to build a firearm, well, then there's a way to get it serialized too.
What are you anticipating is going to happen now with the new formation of our Supreme Court, with whether some of our laws are going to be challenged?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things I didn't talk about as far as our efforts, to deal with the issue of gun violence is that, we have fought in court to defend our common sense gun laws, and we've prevailed in every one of those cases, and the challenge now will be, we have a court that has a particularly different view, and even a broader view of some of the existing case law. And so what you are seeing is the NRA just today sued me, just today before our call over our carry laws. So it's clear where that is heading, without talking about a specific case, that you'll see more of these challenges where groups like the NRA and other gun groups are going to try to get these cases up to the court to strike down some of our carry laws or other laws which they feel infringe on their rights, where we feel that we've struck the right balance for public safety.
How are red flag laws working? How is training being done down to the county and municipality level? Is there any resistance from law enforcement?
No, I think what you'll see is, all of our laws are pro public safety and they're pro law enforcement safety. And so, the ERPO laws, they give law enforcement a tool, to remove firearms from an individual who might pose a danger to themselves or others. And so, we had an extensive amount of training. I issued a directive on the extreme risk protective order. There has been no pushback from law enforcement, and it's seen as an important tool, for both for law enforcement safety and public safety.
Someone's asking, we can't legislate against hate, but how can we use our schools to help change attitudes or education in changing values? And I also have a related question, maybe coming from the opposite perspective, that often adding something to the curriculum of schools seems like an easy out for politicians when they're trying to come up with something to do. And is that really an effective way of dealing with social ills?
Yeah. So listen, it's about adding things to the curriculum. I think that's to have an affirmative anti-bias education, and one that says, it's not enough to say you're not racist, but it's, also to take affirmative steps to be an anti-racist. That's certainly part of it. But when you look at the report, and I'm giving it, I'm not covering all 27 recommendations, but if you look at it, it's not just about that. It's also about restorative justice, right? So if you have an incident happening in a school, it's about educating the young person who might be the aggressor, bringing them together with the victim, to having that understanding of why those words hurt, or why that action cuts a certain way, or why it's not acceptable. So I think that restorative justice piece is huge. I think what else you see in there is that, we want training for teachers to be more sensitive to these issues, so they don't let these types of microaggressions or things go on, or they could be out there as somebody where if somebody is experiencing something that they feel comfortable approaching. Quite often, I did a virtual town hall like this with a young man from New York City, who's at a prep school in New York City. He wrote a piece for the New York Times. His name is Rainier Harris, about his experiences, about how he was the recipient of racist statements, conduct, microaggressions, so many different things. He just didn't have anybody to reach out to because none of the teachers looked like him or could relate to what he was going through. So another piece we talk about is the importance of, how are we doing enough from a diversity point of view, and making sure that we're building a cadre of diverse educators too, because that goes a long way. That really goes a long way, because when you have that type of understanding among educators, and that diversity reflected among educators, that could help young people who might otherwise be looking for somebody to help them. The other thing we talk about is implicit bias training for educators. All of us have these subconscious biases. Are we training our educators enough to recognize them so they're not acting out on them? Are they, when they're disciplining, we know the statistics bear this out, that Black and brown kids get disciplined at a higher rate than white school children. Is that attributed to an implicit bias that educators are not recognizing and acting on? So it's a whole slew of recommendations and really a blueprint for change and addressing so many issues among our schools, which I think, again, I am just very proud of what the Youth Bias Task Force did. And I think that here's another place where New Jersey is going to be a leader.
So there are a couple of questions about other types of guns and gun violence. Like, are you seeing issues with 3D guns? Has that developed into a problem yet? What about pellet guns, or what's the state of the law and enforcement regarding pellet guns?
So yeah, I'm also being sued by those who are trying to introduce, be able to send us the codes to make 3D printable guns into our state. We're in court with Defense Distributed right now in the Fifth Circuit. It's called every once in a while I have to print out the list of lawsuits where I'm on the other side of. Usually sometimes I'm suing, but more often than not, I'm getting sued. But yeah, we are pushing back against 3D printable guns. We feel that they are a danger. We have laws on the books that make them unlawful in New Jersey. And so we believe, again, we don't believe that you should be able to circumvent the process we have in place of going through background checks, of going through a whole slew of steps before you can get a firearm, that you could just print one that's not serialized and have an operable firearm. We just don't think that's good for public safety or law enforcement safety. We have seen 3D printable guns turn up at crime scenes. So it is a problem that we're dealing with, and I think we'll succeed on this litigation that we have with this company that wants to send these introduce these codes for 3D printable guns into our state.
And what about pellet guns? Are you seeing any issues regarding pellet guns?
I don't have a lot of visibility into pellet guns. I can't point to a specific case. That's not to say that we haven't seen cases where somebody is brandishing a pellet gun, pretending for it to be a real gun. I'm sure those cases happen, but I just can't think of one top of mind.
Okay. Are there any current efforts to hold gun manufacturers liable for the results of gun violence?
Yeah, I know a lot of other attorneys general, have looked at this issue from different legal theories. The same way we've held opioid manufacturers liable, the same way we've held other manufacturers of dangerous products liable. So I don't have anything I could share publicly at this time on that.
Okay. What about legislation regarding ammunition? Do we have that kind of legislation in or statutes or pending legislation in New Jersey?
Yeah, we do have we do have legislation that limits who could access hollow point bullets and other dangerous types of ammunition, and so that's on our books as well.
Okay. So I know that you've mentioned a couple of websites. We're going to, Kelly has provided us with that information. We'll include that in our bulletin
Sure.
next month. So anybody who's interested in that, they'll have access to that information. Let's see.
I've done a lot of these. This is a hot bench.
Okay.
Bob Roberger is a litigator. So
what's that?
Yes, but these are
he's a litigator who's answering the
95%
questions.
These are other people.
Okay.
And how are we doing on time? Do we have a?
I'm good till 8. Maybe I shouldn't have said that out loud.
We have a question on whether you have any suggestions about what we can do to get federal laws changed to be stricter. Or,
I on firearms.
yes.
Yeah, I think some of this is just so. Some of the protections are so. Or protections or laws or loopholes that we have to jump through. There's something called the T-Hart amendments, and that these are just obstacles that prevent us from getting information directly from the ATF about crime guns and about traces and about how we could share that, like just fundamental information, or being able to quickly look up and share information among law enforcement agencies. So increasingly, we find ourselves in New Jersey creating frameworks to share this information, which the ATF wants us to have, for example. So if I do a gun trace in Newark and I find this gun in Newark and I get that trace information, only I could see it in Newark. At the state police, I can't see it based on the ATF's regulations and sort of the protections. I don't know what the theory behind that is. So what we did is we created a framework in New Jersey where once that trace is done, that information is shared by that local department. And I directed them to share it with our state police. And our state police then in turn shares it with everybody else in our state. So we've done this jump through hoops to make this workaround to be able to share all this information among ourselves. So each department gets it from the feds, shares it with us, and then we share it with everybody else. And that's not how it should be. We shouldn't have to jump through hoops when we're just trying to prosecute cases, and the ATF was frustrated by these things. So my hope is that with the change in administration, with perhaps more, the tide is sort of shifting in some degree on these issues, on common sense gun safety laws, where states have really led the way, that the federal government follows our lead. I'm not optimistic. I really, don't think we'll get there that quickly, but it's my hope that we will, so we don't have to do things like I just described.
So I know the NRA has been a huge obstacle to reforming gun laws. Do you think that's going to change now with the trouble that they're in New York and the possible demise of the organization altogether?
I think in some regards, the damage has already been done. I think what you have seen, the success of in that regard, if you consider it a success of the administration to date, has been over 200 plus conservative judges, including 3 on the Supreme Court, who share the ideology that the NRA has been pushing for decades. This has been a decades-long march towards where we find ourselves today, towards Heller and these decisions at the Supreme Court, where in my mind are just sort of invented based on like historical documents, but somehow cabined as originalists. And so that was a decades-long push by the NRA and others in the Federalist Society to get these judges on the lower courts, and then filtered all the way up, and they're there now. So I don't know what more needs to be done on that end. I think it's going to be a challenge for us. I think we're going to have to use some of the same legal theories that are the principles of federalism to uphold our state laws. And so I think much of the work will continue to be done at the state level. I don't see it being done at the federal level, not because of the NRA, what they can do now, but what has already been done.
Great. Okay. I think I've covered most of the questions one way or another. Anybody else have any questions?
That was a lot.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've covered the gist of most of the questions. I'm sorry to anybody if you feel I haven't adequately covered. Someone is asking about gun boxes. And I, in fact, don't know what that is. So maybe you can explain what it is and tell us if there's any law with respect to that.
Are you talking about like just the way guns are secured and
I guess so. I don't know.
like biometrics and things like that. I'm not certain, so I don't want to venture out. I'm not aware of any that I know there's. So I don't want to answer incorrectly on that. There's a question on so I just saw here because I touched on it. How can we help put pressure on these huge international media companies to modify algorithms or monitor hate violence in communities? I think that's an excellent question, and this is an initiative that Jonathan Greenblatt at ADL led, and where they boycotted certain advertisers who were advertising on Facebook and on these social media platforms to try to have them be more accountable about their algorithms, about they've had outside consultants. Facebook has look and make recommendations on how they can do more, and they're not meeting the recommendations of their own experts in this regard. And so I think some of those consumer actions can be very powerful. And I think that Stop the Hate campaign, I forget what it's called right now, but it was probably about 2 months ago where it was launched. And I think those types of actions can really force them to do more about their algorithms and be more responsible with them.
So there's a question related to what you were talking about earlier involving the impact of the overall environment, which says that there's been an increase in hate crimes, according to the statistics, and anti-Semitism in the last 4 years since the Trump administration, and whether you're expecting any change with the new change in administration coming up.
I'm hopeful. I mean, I think certainly, if I look at root causes, I go back to the social media companies. I go back to the rhetoric. I look at the overall rise in white supremacist groups that's happened over the last 3 years. What you've also seen is sort of like an overlap. There might not be a shared ideology, but there's a shared enemy. For example, when you look at the protests over the the governor's executive orders. You'll see a coming together of people who, are taking advantage of that moment for recruitment and things like that. My hope is that if you have somebody setting the tone at the top, where they're not giving, they're not, it's not even dog whistles anymore. If they're not giving, speaking favorably about the Proud Boys and talking about, making an equivalency between the people who are at Charlottesville, that has a big difference. And I go back to what I pointed to on the difference between how President Bush acted after 9/11 and how candidate Trump acted after San Bernardino. So it's my hope with that type of action. It's my hope that with increased, there are a lot of challenges to going after the social media companies. There are protections in place for them under the Communications Decency Act. It's called 230 protection, where they're not always held strictly responsible for what appears on their platforms. I think we're looking at ways to work around that, but that's something a new administration could address and maybe hold these social media companies a little bit more accountable in that way. And so I think, I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful because of the efforts that we're undertaking in this state to be proactive on this issue, that we see the numbers. They're not going to turn down this year. The numbers this year will be higher than last year. But it's my hope moving forward with all these efforts that we're undertaking, including that NJ Bias platform that I talked about, that we'll see the trends subside on this issue and on gun violence. And because I do think we are taking really creative steps in this state.
So the question regarding an incident that apparently happened recently in Ridgewood, where a resident in an apartment complex discovered empty boxes of air guns, BB guns, or pellet guns. And when they contacted the police, they were told not to be concerned. Do you have any, assuming that's true, do you have any comment on that? Is that the appropriate thing to do under those circumstances? What really should be?
Yeah, I think it's certainly appropriate to contact law enforcement if you come, if you find those type of materials. They were found where? Discarded?
It seems they said there were boxes that were found, empty boxes.
Yeah.
And the police didn't really respond. They just said that they should not be concerned.
Yeah, I mean, certainly finding weapons is different than finding empty boxes. Obviously people have a right if they go through the process to own firearms and if they own firearms lawfully to discard the boxes that those firearms were purchased in. So I don't know if it's that situation or if there was a trove of weapons, but certainly if we have their information, we could have someone from our Division of Criminal Justice reach out.
Okay. I think the point that's being made is that it should have been investigated. They should have checked if there's someone that was licensed in that building.
Yeah.
So it could be reported to your department for
Sure,
further investigation.
100%. So if you want to follow up and send Kelly the information that the individual wants to follow up, we're more than happy to look into it.
Okay. I think you may have covered this, but there's a question on how New Jersey gun laws compare to other states.
I did. I think, we have much stronger gun laws than our neighboring states and than most other states. If you go to any of the organizations that track and rank, how strong our gun laws are, whether it's Giffords or Brady, we routinely receive an A or an A+. And if you look at some of the states surrounding us, they don't score as high. And so I think the number actually from last year is 83% of our crime guns come from out of state. And the majority of those come from Pennsylvania. And so that is part of the issue that we're contending with, because, we can't, if somebody can go to a gun show and go through a gun show loophole in a neighboring state and pick up firearms and bring them here and sell them and make 3 times the amount of money on the streets in Camden, which we've seen in our criminal cases, that presents us a big problem. And then when you see bad faith dealers who are selling multiple firearms to individuals and those individuals keep going back, red flags should go up, but other states don't have, again, similarly strong gun laws. The Pennsylvania AG and I have talked about this. We'll also share with you the link because I felt that it was important to share this information publicly. We put out GunStat and StateStat reports. They're on our state police's website, where on a monthly basis, and then we'll summarize it quarterly. We'll show the other states where the majority of our crime guns are coming from, and we'll rank them. And that's to shine a light on those states that don't do a good job, and perhaps to force them to do more, and maybe enable their residents, if they're engaging in a setting like this, to use that data to go to their legislators to say, 60% of the crime guns in New Jersey are coming from our state. Why don't we do more to stop that?
So other than advocating for legislation, is there anything that you can suggest that individuals can do to address gun violence and to address hate messaging generally?
Yeah, I mean, obviously two different things. I mean, on the hate messaging, I think a lot of it is, now this is, I want to be careful when I say this, a lot of it is just calling it out when we see it, I think, often, and you want to be safe about it. You don't want to put yourself at risk, but, if you hear it among your social circle, I'm sure all of us have heard somebody say something that crosses that line. I think we have to call it out and say that's not acceptable. And I think that's just part of the personal responsibility. I think, again, I would look at the Youth Bias Task Force reports. I would encourage all of us to take the implicit association test, the IAT. It's available free online to identify your own subconscious biases, to learn how to slow those down and not act on those. And I think that would go a long way. I think part of it is having conversations with young people and really setting for them, what norms are and what's acceptable and unacceptable. Because I think some of that's getting lost, among our young people, as we've seen by these numbers. And so some of that is in educating them on how they could address this when they see it among, their peer groups. And, I've dealt with my fair share of it when I was a young person. But when you see social media, when you see, when I was a county prosecutor in Bergen, you would see kids doing such horrible things to each other on social media, on TikTok, sending a picture of a swastika to a Jewish student on Snapchat. Sometimes they forget that that they wouldn't do that in person, but because they're not seeing each other, I think it becomes somehow less of a deal to them. And I think that's the parents talking to young people, right? That don't send somebody something you wouldn't say to them, and don't say anything like that in the first place, or do anything like that in the first place. So I think a lot of that, falls on us as parents, as neighbors, as friends, to really take a little bit more responsibility in this moment. On the gun side of it, I think what you have seen in this state is grassroots activism really shaping public policy. So that's why I don't want to undersell, pressuring legislators. I think, when we're at a hospital-based violence intervention program announcement, and you see the red shirts out there, and you see the purple shirts out there, you see the activists out there, it really heartens you. I mean, this is not legislation, but this is them impacting, criminal justice policies and programs, and how we're spending our money, and sort of investing more wisely and disrupting patterns of violence. So I think, it's partly asking more of the legislators, partly more engaging with offices like mine or your local police chief, more awareness issues, things of that nature. So, I think that's an important tool in all of these issues.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of your time. So I'm sure the rabbi is going to want to say something, but thank you very much for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate the thoroughness of your answers.
Well, thank you for facilitating it, Robert. Appreciate it.
We try the best we can. Not everyone's comfortable with the technology, but I know I feel the warmth of the community, and certainly the expression of gratitude that we all feel for the time you've spent. In my introduction, I mentioned that I felt, a bond with you, that we were born 3 months from each other and live in New Jersey, but the similarities are more than that. It is that we both are in a position of service where we strive to provide a community where our constituents feel safe and are protected, and at the same time we stand for a community that is just, and we have that aspiration that we pursue. So I want to thank you on behalf of my congregation and the people of the state for all of your work and the inspiration that you provide for us.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. And I hope to do this again in person sometime. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Is there a way, Howard, that I stop the recording? I just closed the thing. You're muted.
I will stop it, and
Oh, because you're the host, right?
I'm the
you're
host. Well,
I forgot that. Okay.
it's all right. And hold on, don't go away yet.